Well, hi, everybody. Welcome once again to the Confident Grief Coach Show. And Cami and I are really, really excited because we have a special guest today who is a special guest, but also a friend and a soul sister of mine from many, many years. And it's Jill Stephenson. So
Hello.
I would like to introduce Jill and tell a little bit about her. And so what I'm going to do is like pull up technical work, her technical sheet that I can read off of. So Jill, kind of her tagline, which is her life, it's her life, is taking life's adversities and turning them into motivation and hope for others. And you'll hear more about her story, pretty incredible story in many, many ways of how she has moved through some adversities and gotten to the other side, even though we know that grief never stops, because it's love, but it really is how do you move forward and make a life that's filled with hope. So Jill is an advanced grief coach through the Confident Grief Coach program. Yay! So she's one of us. So she gets that. She also is a Gold Star family advocate for the 75th Ranger Regiment since 2010. And also she was a TAPS peer mentoring and surviving family member group facilitator for 10 years. So she can tell you a little bit about that. But just to talk a little bit about Jill, she has walked a super long journey, and it began as an early teen um, when her brother died. And so she was like thrown into very rapidly with her family, the whole child loss perspective as a sibling and with her family. And she will talk about how she felt it almost helped her prepare for years later at the loss of her only son, Benjamin. And then she had a lightning strike and lost her home. And so it was like loss after loss after loss, and most of us can't even fathom having gone through and still be standing after all this time. But Jill is one that takes all of this and she just, the wisdom that just emanates from her. She is able to just really speak to people. She's able to support them. Her faith is huge. Her belief in her loved ones, especially Ben, and the signs that she has. I mean, she just has an amazing story. And I can speak to that because I've been around that quite a bit. And I feel like I know Ben quite well, even though I never met him in the physical. But then we did find out years later that Ben and I are actually related distantly. So that's like really super interesting and weird and lovely. So, so she's a leader. She's a motivator. She is real. Jill is Jill. What you see is what you get with Jill. And it's pure compassion and love. And she's a testimony to the ability to be able to find one's way in the darkness. So she's going to talk a little bit about that. So there you go. I made it up kind of, sort of.
Yes.
I didn't
Yeah.
read it exactly. So
Yeah. Well, you know all
welcome.
that stuff. You know all that stuff.
I know, but no, not everybody else does. So we're
That's
really,
true.
really excited to have you here today.
That's true.
Thanks for
Well,
sharing.
thanks for having me, both Pat and Cami. It's nice to be on with both of you and to just chat, to see your faces and chat about who I am, I guess is why we're here, but to share my story and my testimony and my connection with both of you and the Confident Grief Coach. And I wouldn't have come to you if I didn't have a story to tell. And that's how, the dots had connected from my grief story into, well, my friendship, Pat, with you came first, obviously, we know that. And then that rolled into, years later, being involved with the Confident Grief Coach. But as you mentioned, yes, I have been walking a grief journey for a really long time. For, in fact, let's see, 43 years. 43 years, which is hard for me to even fathom sometimes, when I start talking the details of how long I've been in this and what I've survived and how long I've survived, and that I feel okay after all these years. But it began when I was just barely, I was only had turned 15 2 months before my brother died. And he was 11 years old. He was struck by a car, killed instantly, but revived by a highway patrol that happened to be 2 cars behind him, and then kept on life support for 10 days. This was 1982. If it was modern times, more modern times, he probably wouldn't have been on life support for that long, because they would have been able to determine the gravity of his injuries, which subsequently was brain death. But that brain death allowed him to become an organ donor. And that was 1982. Again, I'm going to say that again. And in the state of Minnesota, they didn't even start keeping records for organ donation until 4 years later. And so my family in the state of Minnesota are considered pioneers, true pioneers. And when I hear the word pioneer, I think Little House on the Prairie and wagon trains, like people traveling on like they were the beginning. That was when it all started. And so we were part of that beginning process and beginning recognition of what it means to be a donor family. And that connects forward to Ben. And that's why I bring it up. But that's when my grief journey started, way back in 1982. And so for 27 years, I walked through that. And the grief journey was difficult for first 2 years, very difficult. I was mad at God. I felt responsible in the way that I had guilt and shame for the way that I had treated my little brother, which in hindsight, I came to accept that I didn't treat him any differently than probably most people treat a younger sibling, and how we interacted as siblings. But I was able to work through that, and then became a mother myself only 5 years later, at the age of 20. So a very young mother. But the loss that I had experienced with JT, I was able to turn that into greater love for my own child, and then understood a little bit more. I wouldn't understand my mother's grief journey until many years later, but understood a little bit more what that loss was when I learned just how much you can love a child, just how much love, not you can love a child, just how much you love a child, how much you give of yourself. And your child and your children, I know, it just become your whole world. And so it helped prepare me to be a better mom in that stage of things. And I always had that in the back of my mind, that it helped prepare me to be a better mom. And I certainly was not a perfect mom, not by any stretch. We all have our ups and downs and our faults and whatnot, but 27 years later, almost exactly to the day, is when I lost Ben. Ben joined the military right out of high school. He signed up on the delayed entry program in his senior year. He joined the military out of respect and admiration for my grandfather, his great-grandfather's service in World War II. He was a Minnesota Red Bull and served in the infantry. And then he passed away when Ben was 13. And then 5 months later, 9/11 happened. So those two events coupled together in Ben's 13th year really became his North Star. He wanted to avenge the events of 9/11 in honor of his great-grandfather, because to him, 9/11 was a mockery of what he had fought for. And that's to keep, he would say, keep the bad guys, keep the enemy out of the United States. And so when he witnessed, in the midst of coping with this great sadness of losing his great-grandfather, who was his hero, he just, it lit something in him that never went away. It ignited this fire in his belly that never ever went away. And so I knew from when Ben was very young that he was going to join the military. And everybody who knew Ben from age 13 on up knew that he was going to be the kid that joined the military right after high school. And he did. And he did. And he became, he said actually after my grandfather passed away, or after 9/11, that he was going to become an Army Ranger. And he wanted to do that because he had read Black Hawk Down, right around that same time. And that was a story about a ranger mission where there were a number of rangers and special operation forces who were killed in Somalia. And it was a book and then a movie. And so he was already inspired by the rangers. So he made this declaration at age 13 that he wanted to become a ranger to and find Osama bin Laden himself. And while he didn't find Osama bin Laden, he did become a ranger only 7 months after he graduated from high school, and then served 2 tours in Iraq and then a third one in Afghanistan. And halfway through that one in Afghanistan, he was shot by a sniper while he was called forward as a gun team leader to help 6 of his brothers in arms that were pinned down by a Taliban sniper, and took a bullet to the leg. Underwent surgery in Afghanistan, survived his injuries long enough to make it back to Walter Reed 4 days after he was shot. But 4 days later, he was removed from life support because he was brain dead, just like my brother 27 years earlier. And there I sat with my mother in the hospital while the doctor that was the lead doctor in charge of Ben's care told us that he was brain dead. And I couldn't believe it. It was actually the same day that my brother had been hit by the car, the exact same day, 27 years earlier. I mean, how you can't make that up. How can that be? And in the moment, the first moment when the doctor said this to my mother and I got angry. And I only stayed angry for about 2 minutes. And the words that came out of my mouth were, how can God do this to 2 mothers in the same family? And how can God do this to 2 mothers in the same family? And my mother and I were sitting across from this doctor, and we were in an oversized chair, basically. And so we were sitting right next to each other, like knee to knee. And when I said, how can God do this to mothers in the same family, the second time I looked at her, and there were tears streaming down her face. And I knew in that moment that I wasn't being punished. I knew in that moment that my loss was not just my loss, that it was going to be felt by a lot of other people who love Ben. And here was my mother sitting next to me, who was the pillar of survival. Here she was in her 27th year surviving after losing my brother. And my brother was her only son. He was the youngest of 4, but the only boy and the youngest. So it was, doesn't really matter what order they fall in, but you can put those identifiers on there and it just cuts a little deeper. And so I knew from the very beginning, from 2 minutes into getting the word that Ben would not survive, that God put a blessing right next to me. He showed me the light immediately by having my mother with me on that journey.
Wow.
And yeah, and that was it'll be 15 years in about a month. Yeah. 15 years. And hard to believe that it's gone by that fast. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it's just so surreal to think that it's been that long.
Yeah, it's 15 years. Just, I've known you for, I don't even know how many years, but it's like, we talked about the 10th, when the 10th year anniversary is coming up, and I could see that it was like, no one else may have seen it, but because of our relationship, I could see that this one's a super challenging one. And we talked a lot about that, because when we define time on the earthly realm, 15 years, holy shit, that's a really, really long time.
Yeah.
But then I remember talking to you one time going, but in heaven years or in the spirit years, it's probably a blink.
Yeah.
Right? In eternity, it's a blink of time. But for us, it's like, how did that go so fast? It's been so many years and so many things have changed. Yeah. So you talked about his death, and it wasn't just only to be felt by you, but by so many other people. Can you just share a little bit, just because I know some of this, and Cami, please pop in anytime you have a question. But
this is great. Yeah.
his impact is so great, to the fact that he has the Kopp Etchels, or is it the Etchels Kopp Etchels effect, which I'll have you share about. He had, one of the people that he helped, his brothers in arms, write a best-selling book about that.
Mhm.
There's part of it that's in that situation. Um, People see signs from Ben who don't even know, I mean, who have never met Ben. So can you just kind of describe a little bit about Ben's impact for the 21 years here, but then the impact these last 15 years of how he still shows up so strongly?
Yes, I call that Benergy. It's the Benergy. It's the Benergy, and that is a term that was coined by a gal that grew up with Ben from middle school on up. And there's a story to go with that, but I'll say that for another time. But we've been calling it Benergy since year one, since 2009, and so it's his energy that shows up, and it's never stopped showing up. I have it show up daily in my home. There are a lot of things, so a lot of things and a lot of people that have been influenced by Ben. You mentioned the Kopp Etchels effect, and that's the effect when helicopters are in a location where there's a lot of sand, and they go to land, and the friction from the blades that are spinning and in the midst of the sand causes a ring of light that glows on top of the helicopters, and it literally looks like a halo. And it was named the Kopp Etchels effect because the gentleman who named it was a military blogger. He was also a special forces soldier and had been in that region many times and seen it and discovered that it didn't have a name. And at the time when this took place, which was right before Ben was killed, he was actually there or shot. He was trying to come up with a name for it, and was asking other people's input. And then he got word about Ben's story and how he was, shot on the battlefield, and then, saved 6 of his fellow Rangers, and then died and became an organ donor. And I didn't mention that Ben became an organ donor upon his death as well, because of my brother's influence and because his condition was I don't know ever really know how to say that just right. The means in which he passed away made him eligible to become an organ donor. He qualified to become one. And so Ben became an organ donor upon his death, just like my brother did. And he saved the lives of 4 more people directly. And with his heart, kidneys, and liver. And then he enhanced the lives of 55 more people with the donation of bone, skin, and tissue. So the story got out to this blogger that, he saved men on the battlefield, and then he saved lives upon his death by being an organ donor. So, and then he got word that there was a British soldier who wasn't too far away from where Ben was, who was killed the next day. The day after Ben died, he was killed, and he was a beloved soldier as well, like Ben was. And they had his funeral just later, and he had requested that his ashes be shot out of fireworks. And so this blogger named Michael Yon identified then that effect as the Kopp Etchels effect, named after Benjamin Kopp and Joseph Etchels. And so it is stuck. So that's been seen many times, around the world in different places. And then just the influence of Ben, his persona, his spirit, the people that grew up with him from 5th grade on up, and the men that served with him still honor him and still remember him, and they remember his personality traits, and that he was the best friend to everybody. Every guy that knew Ben in the military said Ben was his best friend. And every guy that knew Ben in middle school and through high school said Ben was their best friend. He was a champion of the underdog. He played football in high school, but he was not a jock. And he was not academic. And he was not the nerd, but he was friends with people in every one of those categories, if you will, that we have in high school. And that carried on with him. And people still learn about his story. all these years later and have come to love Ben. And Pat, you're one of them that people really feel like they know Ben when they learn what kind of a guy he was. And I love that because it keeps the spirit alive. People keep talking about Ben. They still talk about stories, and the greatest sign, we all get signs from our loved ones that pass away from Ben, is a moth. And I experienced that the night of his funeral. I had a moth on the wall in my house when I came home in the evening, and moths have been following me around ever since. I have seen moths in crazy places and places that, how in the world did a moth get in here? Or what's that moth doing up here? And why is it flying at my face? And why is it landing on my face? And in the house I live in now, I live in Arkansas, so in the South. There's a lot of bugs here, and so I have pest control come quarterly, but I've had to have them here monthly because I have so many moths around my back door that you're seeing behind me. I don't ever keep lights on over there. And if I'm in the living room, like I don't ever have bright lights on, but I have moths that just surround that door. And I know it's just Ben. He's just around me all the time, all the time. One night I came in from outside and there were 17 moths in my house, in my living room. And I just laughed. I was like, really, Benjamin? Like, and I feel like that's his way of letting me know that he's here and that everything is going to be okay. That everything is going to be okay. His energy has never left me.
Mhm.
And it just continues to flow into other people. And I absolutely love it.
Yeah, there's that. Well, you and I have had so many deep conversations, but I remember I was writing, I don't know if it was my first one or if it was the How Do I Survive 7 Steps to Living After Child Loss one. So I don't remember. It could have been the very first one where Jill gave me permission to tell Ben's story. And so I was typing away um, up at our house on the cabin, on the lake, on the river, and typing away, typing away. And I was just doing her story and Ben's story. And I look, and here's this big white moth on the inside on the window right there next to me. And I'm like, you just can't make this stuff up because it was a huge white moth, you know? So I'm taking pictures and go, look who's here, you
Yeah.
know? Because, and that, like, for people that are listening, sometimes you might believe, well, I don't see signs or I don't believe in signs. But once you are able to open yourself up to that, it's like they flow in dramatically,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I always say, if you believe, you will receive. You have to believe to receive. And I've watched people start out on their grief journey and not have signs. And then once they get into, about a year and a half to 2 years, then the signs really start flowing when their hearts open up a little more to those signs. And I know people that don't really get signs, and I know more people that get signs all the time. And I feel like I get them all the time. And it's because I am open to it and I receive them because I believe in them.
Yep, yep, Faith. Now this is a whole nother question. And so Cami, it kind of goes to, you had posed a question on a group that you're on Facebook, and it was about a woman and her husband who experienced child loss. And the husband was having great difficulty. And so she was on a very different trajectory. And so this is kind of weird. I wasn't planning on this, but I know your dad very well, love John dearly. And so you not only, it's not only JT, but you have experienced another brother,
Mhm.
nephew, and a niece in a very fairly short period of time, right? That have all transitioned. So your dad, not taken away from your mom, but as a male figure and as the father, what do you see that helped him, because he has had layer upon layer upon layer of deep, tragic loss of his children and grandchildren? Because John, also, your dad, is truly a survivor.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What I see is what I mentioned about my mother in the very beginning. She just happened to be the one sitting with me in those moments. My dad just hadn't made it to the hospital yet, because we were in another state. but I see that in him too, that pillar and that strength of survival. And I lost my dad. My parents got divorced. They were divorced when JT died, but they'd been divorced for, I don't know, maybe a year and a half or 2 years, not a real long time. And then my dad got remarried. And 2 years after I had Ben, he had another son named Alex. And then eventually my dad divorced Alex's mother. And then he raised Alex from his teenage years, like from 13, 14-ish on up. Alex came to live with him and stayed with him. And then they were very, very close. And my dad always believed that Alex was God's way of giving him a second chance with another son, because my dad had lost JT as well. And 6 years ago, when Alex was 27, he died in his sleep. And this is my father's second son that he's lost. And prior to that, Ben, in the years before that, 9 years earlier, no, not 9 years. I'm not, yeah, 9 years anyway. He experienced that loss, and him and Ben were pretty close as well. And I have seen him become stronger in his faith because of the loss of Alex, and just knowing that his sons are together and that they're there with Ben and his parents and, other relatives that have gone before, but mostly that they're together, and he knows that they're in a safe place and that they're surrounded by love and encompassed in love. And one of the really profound things that came up in speaking with him about this is that when JT died in 1982, how many years ago was that? And then that the time frame of when my father would join him again seemed like an eternity away. And he said, fairly soon after Alex died, he said, the blessing in all of this is that I don't have to wait as long to see him again.
Mhm.
Wow.
Thoughtful.
Never thought about that. I mean, of course, we all don't know when our number is going to be called. We absolutely have no idea. But, the law of odds and, what is, most normal is that he will see Alex again very soon. He's almost 79. And so odds are he's not going to have to wait the years to see him that he's had to wait to see JT. And that was a big moment when he shared that with me. I was like, wow, Dad, I never thought about that. And so one of the tools that I share with people that are, beginning in a grief journey too, is to not think about the years that they've been gone. Like in my case, I'll say, I could really speak with a heavy heart and a pit in my stomach and say, I've been dealing with this for 15 years. It's been so hard, and 15 years is so long to be missing somebody. Or I could put the positive spin on it and bring the light into it and say, I am 15 years closer to seeing him again. I have survived for 15 years. I have lived for 15 years without him here. I have been able to grieve for 15 years and grown a deeper love over the last 15 years because his energy still surrounds me.
So beautiful. Cami.
Yeah, I have a question. I know you could tell. You spoke a little bit about your dad being this pillar of strength, and you mentioned how strong he is and this beautiful perspective that he has with his faith and with his excitement and his love for seeing his kids again one day. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to if emotionally, how he was able to process some of that. Because I think from what I've seen, from what Pat was talking about, this woman that I had spoken with about her husband really not having a good time, really having a terrible time, of course, losing his son. And from his perspective, from what I understood, his idea of being strong through this was totally disconnected from his grief and from his emotions and from just not allowing himself to feel any of the like negativity around the grief. So he avoided it. And that was from what I understand, his perspective of what it means to be strong. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to what that means in your dad's case, what that looks like for him in his strength, to speak how men might be able to process this in a different way.
We do know that men and women process grief differently. And there, we could unpack why that is. And very simply, we know that there's just a difference in how men and women process emotions. And women, of course, are much more emotional. We are the more emotional of the two sexes. And we carry the babies. They are they are cellularly a part of our bodies for 9 months. And so there's that extra connection. And then men are just brought up, society wise, to not be vulnerable, that it may be viewed as being weak if you show your vulnerabilities or your weaknesses. And so you gotta, kind of be that, unga bunga, I'm strong, I don't have emotion type of thing. And I've seen that fall to the wayside more and more over the years. And in the community in the grief community that I am attached to, I've seen men open up to it more because they have realized that it has been more healing for them to be emotional and to show their emotions and talk about their emotions than it is to be the strong, silent type. And so the healing comes when they kind of kick that notion to the curb and say that, you know what, I'm going to be vulnerable here, and I'm going to admit that I have hurt feelings, and and it's okay for me to stand here and shed tears in front of people that may be judging me and not care what they think, because it is still a heavy burden for the men. My father lost his only two sons, and we could easily accept the fact that of him being angry about that, or feeling that it's personal, or that he was punished for that. And he's never saw it that way. And I think that, he was raised by a strong woman, by a strong mother, and he was around other strong women in his life. And he has a measure of faith as well, and that has grown stronger over the years. And I have influenced that in him because he and I are very close, and we have remained very close through the years. And I, in fact, was living out of state when Alex died, and I didn't have any intention of moving back to Minnesota. And he kept asking me to come back. He was living alone, in the house. He had a big house, and I just did not want to go back to Minnesota. And a friend convinced me that, I had an opportunity here to spend time with my dad. And, as he gets older, that I would be silly to not take advantage of that. And I realized that he was right. And so I moved back to Minnesota, and I lived with my dad for 2 years until I came to Arkansas. And it was a really special time for us. It was we shared our grief on a very deep level. And like, as I mentioned earlier, I saw his faith grow in that, and just trusting that both of his sons were okay, and that it was okay for him to be vulnerable. And even though I had been watching him and my mother be strong over the years and coping with the loss, my father then shared with me that I inspired him by him seeing how had been able to walk in my grief journey since losing Ben. And then I became an inspiration to him. And so we've shared that and have remained very close. So for men, I know it's different. It's different. And it's also, if it's maybe thinking of the male versus female, it's kind of a helpless thing, because men are, they're taught to be providers. We're raised in the society to believe that the men are the providers, and they're supposed to keep the bad things away. They're the keepers of the castle. And I tune it to, if you've ever witnessed childbirth, if you've ever been in a room with someone having a baby, there's absolutely nothing you can do to help that woman. Absolutely nothing you can do. You can be as nice as can be. And I can only speak from experience, like my own mother was like, oh, let me give you ice chips. And I was like, get out of my face.
Don't you
know,
dare touch me.
yeah, get out of here. I know I said you could be here, but get out of here. Okay, come back. Wait, don't
Yeah,
leave.
yeah,
You're just in a helpless position where you can't do to take away that hurt from somebody. And we want to, with our loved ones, with people that we care about, we want to help them. We want to encourage them. And it's difficult to be able to do that when you have a traumatic experience and a great loss, whatever
Well,
that.
yeah, and I also think too, just knowing your dad and knowing many dads, grieving dads, and I'm just going to go with the masculine, feminine, it's not to denote one thing or the other, but we do know that there's a difference. But even the masculine energy, the yang in
Mhm.
Chinese and symbology and that type is the masculine. It's the worker, it's the doer, it's that type of thing. Where the yin energy is the nurturing and the soft and that real emotional piece. And your dad has worked his ass off.
Yeah.
He's had his own business and it's been a physical business. And I often wonder if that helps in the grieving process for the men, is that they can go out, and we as women are like, but they're not processing it. Well,
Mhm.
if you're hammering something every single day and putting posts and holes and digging holes and doing that physical labor, that may be their processing of it.
Oh
But
yeah.
we as women are like, oh, he's not talking about it.
Yeah.
They don't need to talk about it because and we even know, all being grief coaches, right? We
Mhm.
know that it comes into the body. So they're releasing
Yes. Yeah.
emotion
Yeah.
and maybe expressing it in a physical way, healthy physical way for them
Mhm. Mhm.
versus, having to sit down and talk therapy. Right.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
and having their tribe, it's interesting because you're kind of your dad's tribe,
Mhm.
which is unusual, but it's because of, having journeyed a very similar walk. And like he said, he saw you and just like, well, if Jill can do this,
Yeah.
I know that faith is important,
Mhm.
right? But
Yeah.
that's where I still go back to with, when I'm working with families and men especially, it's just like, who's maybe one or two people that you can just lean into to talk, that isn't a family member, that isn't, that you can just talk to. And I think, Jill, with all that you've done with the veteran community and that type of thing, if they can sit down with one or two of their soldiers in arms and just have a conversation and open up, that's when, it's like, okay, we're giving air to this trauma
Yeah.
and this despair and this grief that we've been holding. And we know that when we can give it air, then we can allow some healing to begin,
Right.
right?
Right. Right. Yeah. We give it energy and when we speak it, it comes alive and it's
Yeah,
not stuck inside of us.
yeah. Well, I know that we could go on like I could talk to Jill for days, and
Yeah.
Cami, I'm sure you have like a bazillion things. But is there any one last question that you have for Jill, or anything that you want to comment on before we close up shop today?
Yeah, I do have a question. As a grief coach and as someone who does not have the experience of having a kid or losing a child, I'm wondering what advice you might have for other grief coaches like myself who might be in a position to speak with other grieving parents, and just any advice that you could give to other grief supporters when it comes to speaking from your experiences.
I would say, I mean, two things come to mind right away is to meet people where they're at. To meet people where they're at. I think that's really important to understand that we all function at different energetic levels, and including when we go through difficult things, any adversity, not just grief, but any major adversity that can be, the loss of a job, divorce, illness, injury, financial burdens, any type of thing that really kind of strikes us. Meet them where they're at and understand that there's a process that is going to take place, and we have to help give them the tools that they're going to need to kind of, climb up out of that hole, if you will. Throw them the rope, have the tools ready for them, but meet them where they're at to begin with. And that goes into forming a tribe, for people, that encouragement. Pat mentioned that, having one or two people that you're close with to speak with about what you're going through. And in some of Pat and I's earlier conversations, when she began writing the books, she asked me, what is the number one thing that I would tell people to do or that helped me? And I said, my tribe, finding the community to speak with. And so that is, you can be a member of that tribe as grief coaches. We definitely are part of that tribe because people are, are opening up to us and sharing with us, and then we're giving them tools. But very, very important. I still am connected very strongly to people that have this journey for a similar amount of time that I have in the military community, and then people that I've just met in the years since then that have suffered a loss, not necessarily in the military community, but much like, a law enforcement officer or a soldier, or a person who suffered a child loss, or survived a major injury or illness, we can speak the same language to each other. And I think that's really important. To be able to have that no language barriers, in that we understand, we can say, you know what, today I just wanted to, throw everything out the window. I just wanted to take all this stuff related to, this illness, this injury, this death, and just get it out of here. I felt very angry and upset, and you can understand that because you've been there. And then you might share that, you know what, today I just really felt like I wanted to open up that chest that had all their memorabilia and their clothing in it. And I just cried and I hugged their shirts, and it was a different experience. But we can speak that language to each other and they understand, and we understand each other. I think that's very important. So just meeting people where they're at and not having the expectation that they need to be, at a different level, and then connecting with people who understand your language.
Connecting at the heart. I
Yeah.
mean, that's the bottom line, is
Yeah.
just holding that space and connecting at the heart and loving the person that's in front of you. Whether it's a client or a family member or a friend or a foe,
Yeah.
you just love them unconditionally with compassion,
Yes.
with total compassion. So, well, what we're going to do here is, once I'm going to get all of Jill's information in the show notes. Jill is an advanced certified grief coach. She's also a clergy, a minister. I don't know what you call yourself. But
I have a certification for ministry as well.
ministry. And so, her faith is, so if, you would like to talk to Jill, we'll have her contact information in there, so you can reach out to her also. And if you're military, I mean, this is one person that you could really, she gets it. She has been, long after Ben left physically, he has guided her with this family of military family, and she is just a strong advocate for that. I call her Mama Jill of the Gold Star, because a lot of these Ranger young men, or even older than her, they gravitate to her, and she really is like this mother figure. And I think Ben has helped her be that person that is needed to be that beacon of light, that Mother Jill of the Gold Star. So, and Gold Star families in the United States are families who, their loved one has died during
Active duty,
active duty and
combat,
in
combat or training.
combat or training. Yeah. So thank you, Jill, so much. Of course, I love the heck out of you and can't wait till we can actually see each other in real life. And Cami, thank you for being here, and we'll talk to you guys soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you, Jill. Thanks, Pat.
Thanks for having me.